Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the place where we dust off half-forgotten names, roll out old maps across creaking tables, and stare across the centuries at the souls who gave shape to the world you and I walk on today. Tonight, we set sail, not with Columbus or Magellan, but with a man whose name might just be more famous than his deeds, yet whose keen eyes and restless questions helped redraw the very map of the earth. His name? Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine merchant's son who never captained mighty fleets or conquered golden cities, yet whose letters and voyages whispered a simple, astonishing truth, that the lands across the Atlantic were not the far edges of Asia, but a brand new world altogether. Tonight, we chart the currents that carried Vespucci from the counting houses of Florence to the harbors of Spain and Portugal, to muddy riverbanks in Brazil and the broad mouth of the Amazon. We'll see what he saw, doubt what he doubted, and ask how his name came to crown two continents while so many others were forgotten. So pour yourself something warm, set your compass true, and come with me into the wind and salt spray as we walk the decks beside Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo was born on March 9, 1454, into a city humming with new ideas and old ambitions. Florence in those days was not some sleepy medieval town. It was a crucible of genius and gold. Here, bankers bankrolled cathedrals that scraped the sky. Here, artists like Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci painted visions that still hang in gilded frames. Here, merchants traded silks and spices from across the known world, a city whose hunger for profit was matched only by its hunger for knowledge. Amerigo's family was not among the Medici or the Grand Dukes, but they were comfortable. Respected merchants and notaries, scribes and traders who made their living with ledgers and careful dealings. His father, Nastagio Vespucci, worked in the city's bustling wool trade, the very fabric of Florence's wealth, spun from sheep's backs to gold coins in Florentine coffers. From an early age, Amerigo showed a mind that wandered beyond bolts of cloth and balance sheets. He was no brawler nor princeling, but a quiet boy, fascinated by books. It was his uncle, Giorgio Antonio Vespucci, who opened the world wider for him. Giorgio was a learned Dominican friar, steeped in Latin, astronomy, geography, and the ancient wisdom of Ptolemy's dusty maps. Under his uncle's stern but patient eye, young Amerigo learned to read the heavens, the sun's arc, the stars that guided traders and dreamers alike. He read the old travelogues, Marco Polo's distant adventures, the strange beasts said to roam the Orient. His mind stretched beyond Florence's high walls into the unknown. But childhood in Florence was not all books and ink. He grew up in a city where fortunes were made and lost overnight, where riots could sweep the streets, when bread ran short or rival families clashed for power. Amerigo learned caution and calculation. He saw how wealth and knowledge could raise a man high, and how quickly gossip or a banker's ruin could dash him back into dust. When he reached manhood, Amerigo did what so many Florentine sons did. He stepped into the world of trade. He worked for Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, a cousin of the great Lorenzo the Magnificent. This branch of the Medici trusted Amerigo enough to send him far beyond Florence to manage their fortunes abroad. It was a respectable life, not glamorous but solid, promising a steady rise through diligence and loyalty. And yet, under the careful records and balance sheets, Amerigo Vespucci carried that boyish curiosity still, that itch for maps, for places unseen, for mysteries the ledgers could never balance. He was a child of Florence, but Florence, for all its splendor, was landlocked. If you wished to chase the horizon, you needed the sea. And so, in his 30s, Amerigo set his sights on Seville, Spain's great Atlantic gateway. It was there, among shipwrights and sailors, that this careful Florentine merchant would trade counting coins for chasing coastlines and write his name across the face of the world. So, my friends, we've seen Amerigo Vespucci, the boy with books in Florence, the young man at his uncle's knee learning to measure the stars, the careful merchant balancing columns of trade in the Medici ledgers. But paper only carries a man so far. If you wish to know what's over the horizon, you must hoist your sails. The road to the sea for Vespucci began not with fanfare or royal decree, but with quiet calculations and a hunger that would not sleep. In the 1480s, as Europe's kingdoms schemed for spices and gold, Spain was rising, flush with fresh silver from its reconquered lands, its eyes fixed firmly westward. The Portuguese had locked up the African coast and the route around the Cape of Good Hope. But what if there was a shorter way, a passage west, straight to the riches of Cathay and the Indies? In Florence, Vespucci watched men talk of maps that still showed dragons at their edges. He watched the Medici extend their banking fingers into Seville, that roaring port on the Guadalquivir River where ships were built, crews were bought, and rumors of new discoveries flowed thicker than the wine. Around 1491, Amerigo packed up his accounts and left Florence for Seville to serve as an agent for Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici. There, among the shipyards and salty taverns, the tidy merchant stepped into the thrum of an empire in waiting. It was there he crossed paths with explorers and entrepreneurs, men with more nerve than navigational sense, and with one name in particular, Christopher Columbus. When Columbus returned from his first voyage in 1493, proclaiming he had found the outlying islands of Asia, Seville caught fire with rumor and gold lust. Vespucci's role at first was practical. He provisioned ships, arranged crews, tallied cargoes of sugar and exotic goods. He was the quiet man behind the curtain, making sure sails were stitched and barrels stocked. But numbers were not enough. By the late 1490s, Vespucci, now in his 40s, an age when many men of his station would settle comfortably behind a counting desk, stepped forward with a question that gnawed at his reason. What if these new lands were not Asia at all? The evidence didn't add up. Columbus's islands were far larger than expected. The coasts stretched endlessly south. The people were not Asian traders, but something wholly unfamiliar, with languages, customs, and flora no old map could explain. So Vespucci traded his quill for a quadrant. Between 1497 and 1504, he joined several expeditions. Historians still debate whether it was 2 or 4, Spanish or Portuguese, but the broad strokes remain. He sailed south along the coasts of what we now call South America. He stood on tropical shores where parrots screamed in the canopy and rivers poured fresh water so vast they pushed back the salty sea. He was not a captain commanding fleets. He was an observer, a chronicler, an educated mind measuring stars, logging latitudes, scribbling strange flora and fauna. His training in astronomy served him well. Vespucci was among the first Europeans to see the Southern Cross blaze over unknown waters, proof that he had crossed deep into a hemisphere untouched by Europe's ancient maps. He wrote letters home, rich with stories of a new world, of people who lived so differently from any imagined in European books, of coastlines that ran unbroken for hundreds upon hundreds of leagues. He estimated distances, sketched rudimentary charts, and tried to puzzle it all into reason. Did he embroider these letters? Almost certainly. They were meant to dazzle as much as to inform, to keep the sponsors interested, the crown's purses open, and his own name in the courts of Europe's kings. But in those vivid pages lay a claim that would echo louder than any swords clash, that this was not the edge of Asia, but an entirely separate continent, vast and lush and waiting to be mapped. When he returned to Seville, Vespucci the merchant had transformed into Vespucci the explorer, or at the very least, the man who told the story that changed Europe's mind about the world it thought it knew. He never claimed gold or kingdoms. He didn't command armies or carve out colonies. But he showed that sometimes the sharpest edge in the explorer's kit is not the blade, but the pen. Picture it now, the dawn of the 1500s, a world half-charted, half-dreamed, a Europe clutching old parchment maps scribbled with monsters and medieval guesses, and a merchant from Florence standing at the mouth of the Amazon scribbling something new in the damp, salt air. Amerigo Vespucci's letters, those lively, boastful reports he dashed off to friends and patrons, were far more than private updates. They were a spark tossed into the tinder of a continent hungry for news that they might just be standing at the threshold of a world no scholar of Aristotle, Ptolemy, or Marco Polo had ever fully imagined. Vespucci's accounts described lands so vast and so different that they strained the old worldview to its breaking point. He described coastlines stretching thousands of miles, far too long to belong to Asia's edge. He described constellations unseen in the northern hemisphere, tropical forests teeming with creatures never sketched in Europe's bestiaries. He described people with languages, customs, and ways of life entirely alien to any courtly tales of the Far East. What Amerigo did, and what Columbus could not bring himself to do, was to say out loud what the signs all pointed to. These shores were not Asia at all. This was something entirely separate, a new world, a phrase that once uttered could never be put back in the box. But here's where the story tilts, because Vespucci was not just an explorer but a storyteller. He understood that discovery was not merely measured in miles sailed, but in the words that shape men's minds. And so his letters, whether genuinely authored by his own hand, polished by editors, or even exaggerated by printers eager to sell, painted him as a new Marco Polo, a learned observer unlocking a world of wonders for the European imagination. These accounts spread like wildfire through the newly humming presses of Europe. They were printed, reprinted, translated into Latin and German, devoured by scholars and merchants alike. They were read in candlelit rooms by men who would never see a palm tree, but who would soon redraw every map they'd ever owned. And then came the name. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller, part geographer, part printer, part scholar, sat in the small town of Saint-Dié in Lorraine, working with a circle of intellectuals who believed they were standing at the dawn of a new age. They read Vespucci's published letters, the Mundus Novus among them, and seized on one line, the idea that these lands were a new world unknown to the ancients. To them, Vespucci, not Columbus, deserved credit for recognizing this truth. Waldseemüller wrote, "I see no reason why anyone should object to calling this part America after Amerigo, its discoverer, a man of great ability." So, on his map, the first to depict the Western continents as separate from Asia, Waldseemüller printed a name that had never existed on parchment before: America, land of Amerigo. And just like that, a continent, really, two entire continents, took on the name of a man who never ruled a kingdom, never commanded an armada, never founded a colony. He was not the first European to set foot on its soil. The Vikings had beaten everyone by centuries, and Columbus's caravels had carried men ashore years before Vespucci. But Amerigo's name stuck because he dared to say what others would not, that this was a new world altogether. The irony is as rich as old velvet. Columbus died stubbornly believing he had touched Asia. Vespucci, the merchant-turned-mapmaker's muse, had no crown, no title, yet his signature outlasted empires. America would be stitched onto maps, treaties, and charters. It would roll off the tongues of millions who would never know the Florentine merchant who gave it its label. In that sense, Vespucci reminds us that sometimes it's not who plants the flag, but who writes the story, and who prints the map that shapes the world's memory. And so, from the presses of Germany to the harbors of Spain, the name America drifted into common use. Slowly at first, then as surely as a tide. By the time new waves of explorers crossed the Atlantic in the generations to come, they sailed not for Cathay or Sapangu, but for America, that dream of endless coastlines, vast rivers, and riches yet unseen. It is a strange legacy, my friends. Vespucci himself would never have claimed he discovered these lands alone. But history, fickle as it is, wrote his name in bold letters while othered footnotes. We've walked with Amerigo Vespucci from the counting houses of Florence to the brackish mouth of the Amazon. We've watched him stand on tropical shores, sketching constellations no Roman or Greek had ever named. And we've seen how his letters, like driftwood cast upon Europe's shores, carried the seed of a name that would outlive kings. But what became of the man himself, this merchant-turned-mariner, whose name now drapes two vast continents like a banner in the wind? After those fateful voyages, some real, some perhaps embroidered for eager printers, Vespucci returned to Spain, a man transformed but not yet immortal. He never amassed the staggering fortunes claimed by conquistadors or sugar barons. He had no chest of plundered gold, no titles to pass down to sons, for Amerigo and his wife, Maria Cerezo, never had children. His legacy would not lie in heirs, but in ink. Back in Seville, he did what many seasoned explorers did once the sea had scoured the salt from their bones. He settled into the quieter work of guiding other men's voyages. In 1508, King Ferdinand of Spain, recognizing Vespucci's keen mind and valuable experience, appointed him Piloto Mayor, chief navigator of Spain's Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade. It was a powerful post, though few today remember it. From this dusty office near Seville's bustling docks, Vespucci helped shape the next generation of explorers. He oversaw the training of pilots, those men who would stand on the decks of caravels and carracks, squinting at stars and squalls, praying their charts were true. He refined navigation manuals, standardized maps, and checked ship logs for accuracy. All vital work in a tiny error in longitude could mean the difference between landfall and a watery grave. In these quiet final years, Amerigo Vespucci's mind became a bridge, his hard-won lessons guiding sailors who would push beyond where he had stopped. Yet for all this, there was no grand estate, no marble palace. He lived modestly in Seville, just another trusted servant of the Spanish crown, a man who had helped Europe open its eyes wider, but who now spent more nights hunched over parchment than under foreign stars. On February 22nd, 1512, at the age of 57, Amerigo Vespucci breathed his last in Seville, far from the bustling Florentine streets of his birth, far too from the lush jungles of Brazil that had made his name. He died not at sea, nor on some distant shore, but in the quiet of his adopted city, taken by malaria, the old scourge of sailors and port towns. His funeral did not draw crowds like a king's passing might. There were no grand processions. The man whose name would echo across continents left this world quietly, his final voyage adrift into shadows, his stories left behind to carry him where his body could no longer go. No great monument rose over his grave. And yet, every time a schoolchild traces North and South America on a classroom map, every time a passport stamps United States of America, every time a ship's captain fixes their course westward over the Atlantic, Amerigo Vespucci's ghost sails with them. His final voyage, then, was not into uncharted waters, but into something stranger. An immortality built not of gold or conquest, but of letters, maps, and a single bold idea that the world was bigger than any king had dared to dream. So, my friends, why speak this old Florentine's name at all? Half a millennium after his last breath drifted out over the narrow streets of Seville, why dust off his letters, his sketches, his half-forgotten arguments about Asia and the New World? Why does Amerigo Vespucci matter today, in our age of jet engines, GPS, and satellite maps that leave not an inch of coastline uncharted? The answer is simple, and yet not so simple at all. First, there is the name, America. Every letter we write, every history book, every passport, every flag draped in triumph or grief, they all carry an echo of a merchant's scribbled truth, that there were worlds beyond the old maps, places no ancient emperor could claim, places no papal decree could fence in. Vespucci's name became shorthand for that daring realization, that the earth was bigger than even Columbus had guessed, that its mysteries would not be tamed by old books or comfortable lies, but it goes deeper than the word etched on our continents. Vespucci reminds us that discovery is not always the work of conquerors and cannons. Sometimes it is the work of curiosity, of asking questions that break the old stories. Columbus sailed west chasing Asia. Vespucci looked at the same horizon and asked, "What if we're wrong?" That question cracked Europe's medieval shell wide open. In his letters, half exaggeration, half keen-eyed report, Vespucci gave Europe something new, a reason to redraw the world. He taught monarchs, mapmakers, and merchants to question the dusty wisdom of the ancients, to trust what they saw with their own eyes, the stars overhead, the currents beneath their keels, over what musty libraries claim to know. You and I live today in a world that still needs that lesson. We stand on continents he never truly ruled, but his spirit hovers over every new frontier. The deep-sea trenches we have yet to plumb, the far reaches of Mars, the distant planets that wink at us like the Southern Cross did to Amerigo under South American skies. He whispers, still, look closer. Don't accept what you're told just because it's written in old ink. Test it, sail it, measure it again. His story is also a reminder of how power and legacy work. Vespucci did not command armies. He did not claim land by force. He did not build cities that bore his name. He didn't even name America himself. But his letters shaped the way cartographers and kings thought, and in the end, ideas can stick longer than empires. They can shape what schoolchildren memorize centuries later. In the ironies of his life, a merchant's son who became an immortal name, a second-string explorer whose pen was mightier than Columbus's sword, we see how fragile the telling of history truly is, how a name can travel further than its bearer ever did, and how every map, every border, every bold line on a globe is more than ink. It's a story someone told and someone else believed. So the next time you trace your finger over a globe, from Canada's icy capes to Patagonia's windswept cliffs, remember the Florentine merchant who peered over the ship's rail, caught the scent of the jungle drifting on the wind, and dared to say, "This is something new." Because in every age, whether you're charting the Amazon, the moon, or the depths of your own mind, the real voyage, my friends, is not only about finding new lands, it's about seeing the old ones with eyes that refuse to be satisfied with yesterday's maps. So, my friends, here we stand at the prow of Amerigo Vespucci's story, looking back at the wakes his voyages left on the face of the earth. A Florentine clerk turned sailor turned ghost, a man whose restless mind cracked the old maps wide open, whose letters stitched a new word into our history: America. We began tonight on the winding streets of Renaissance Florence, a boy in ink-stained sleeves learning to chart the heavens at his uncle's knee. We followed him to Seville's salty docks, where the hum of shipwrights and the brine of the Guadalquivir called him away from ledgers to the promise of far-off shores. We sailed with him past the mouth of the Amazon under alien constellations, watched him puzzle out that this was no edge of Asia but a whole new world, lush and vast and real. And we saw him die as so many explorers do, not in the roar of cannon or the flash of gold, but quietly, his mind lingering in letters and charts, even as his bones rested under Seville's humble earth. And yet, centuries later, his ghost sails on. In every border dispute, in every passport stamped United States of America or República Argentina or America Latina, in every schoolchild's globe spinning bright blue on a desk, in every argument about who first found these lands, a Viking's prow, a Genoese captain's dream, or a Florentine's quill. Amerigo Vespucci reminds us of something history too often forgets, that sometimes the most world-changing legacy doesn't come from the general's sword or the monarch's crown, but from the merchant who asked the next question, the navigator who measured the stars just once more, the storyteller who refused to accept the old maps as gospel truth. And so, as you put out your lanterns tonight and roll away this tale like an ancient sea chart, remember that the world is always bigger than we think, wider than any border drawn by an old king's decree. The map is never finished. The names we give it, the stories we tell about it, these are the true discoveries. Thank you, my friends, for standing with me tonight, beside the counting desk in Florence, the sails snapping in the Atlantic wind, the jungles that whispered secrets to a man with curious eyes. This has been Faces of History, where we keep company not only with emperors and rebels, but with merchants, mapmakers, and dreamers who remind us that the world is as new as the questions we dare to ask. Until next time, I remain your host and fellow traveler in the great unfinished atlas of our human story, the Duke of New York. Good night, and may your compass always find true north.